Okay, let me check all of the... We appear to be live. Let me just double check on all the destinations.
You on StreamYard?
We're on Restream right now. Good.
Okay, cool.
We are live. Welcome to the show. This is Dr. Jason Dean, Revolution Network, your source for health, freedom, and knowledge. And we are streaming live today to, again, Facebook Live, YouTube, Twitter, Periscope. So everyone out there can see us. And we are rocking and rolling. And I have on today, and yes, the comments are coming in, so welcome. I have a really cool guy that I've been following probably for at least the last 6 months on Twitter. His name is DeAngelis of the Reason Foundation. Also, and I'll let him all explain all this information, his background as well. But he's also been from the Cato Institute. But Corey, welcome to the show today. Thank you for being here.
Hey, thanks for having me, Jason. I'm really excited to talk with you.
Absolutely. And before we even jump into all this stuff, because it's going to be a fun conversation, give everyone a background on who you are, where you're from, because I know you've been with the Cato Institute, but you're with the Reason Foundation, just so everyone can get your credentials, because you know a lot in this area.
Yeah, I really started out doing academic work on the effects of school choice programs on test scores, but then also non-academic outcomes like crime and mental health as well. But then after that, I transitioned into the think tank world as a policy analyst in education at the Cato Institute. Now I'm full-time as the director of school choice at the Reason Foundation. I'm still affiliated with Cato as an adjunct scholar. And I'm also the executive director at the Educational Freedom Institute, a new think tank as well.
Awesome. And so it's very interesting because if people don't know a bunch of these organizations, you're a very libertarian-minded individual. So when it comes down to all this political stuff going on, whether it's like in the actual political world or the school aspect, you look at this from a very, and I don't say neutral standpoint, but very liberty standpoint, from a libertarian standpoint, and the fact that like we should be choosing individual freedoms and liberties over everything, even in the school system. So yeah, give us a little background on how you came to that mindset, because I don't know this for sure, but I'm assuming you had a very different growing up school system for yourself than most people do.
Yeah, I'm super libertarian. I'll admit that right up front. And I first figured this out in high school when the professor or teacher gave us the political ideology quiz, and he posted everybody's results on the political ideology spectrum, and little old me was all the way in the corner, about as libertarian as you can get, probably a little further out than even Milton Friedman as far as the political spectrum. But yeah, I actually went to government-run schools all through K through 12, my K through 12 education in San Antonio, Texas. And I actually had a pretty bad experience. I did really well grade-wise, but in middle school, I was subject to, a lot of negative socialization. There was a lot of violence on campus, bullying, drugs. And so, I mean, there's a lot of things that I saw going wrong with the government-run school system. But then when I got to high school, I actually got to go to a magnet school, which is still a government-run school, but it's a school that you can choose. And in my district, you had 4 different schools you could pick from. And what a magnet school is, it's still a government school, but you're not residentially assigned to it, which gets rid of a lot of that monopoly power that is rampant in the government school system today. Because, just imagine if you were residentially assigned to your nearest Walmart, and that Walmart happened to be run by the government. They probably wouldn't really do a good job because you couldn't vote with your feet to go anywhere else. And that's what I see to be a big problem with the government-run school system. I had a good experience in my magnet school, and I think it's because of that choice. The magnet school was actually on the physical campus of the government-run school that I was residentially assigned to, and just walking through the campus, you could see the night and day difference that at the government-run residentially assigned school that I was supposed to go to, there was a lot of fighting going on, a lot of drugs, a lot of gang activity. You walk by the school classroom doors of the classrooms, didn't seem like there was a lot of actual learning going on. There was just a lot of disorder in the classroom. And so I want other people to have that kind of choice, for everyone in the United States to be able to choose the school that works best for them. There's no reason why we need to residentially assign kids to schools and create this big, bloated, expensive monopoly system. And we shouldn't just limit it to government-run schools. We should allow people to take their education dollars that we're already spending on whatever type of school works best. Maybe that's a magnet school. Maybe that's a charter school. Maybe that's a private school. maybe you think that, especially as a result of COVID-19, maybe this test drive of homeschooling gets the idea that maybe homeschooling is a really for your family. Well, if you make that decision for your kid, we spend about $15,424 per child per year in government schools in the U.S. Why should that money to educate your child stay in the government school if you're educating your child at home? You should be able to take at least, like let's say 12,000 of those dollars. You'd save some taxpayer money, let the government school keep some for adjustments. You should be able to take at least 12,000 of those dollars. The money should follow the child. That's where my ideology really comes from. And I think about other programs like this, like Pell Grants or GI Bill, which are essentially vouchers for higher education. The money goes to the student. The student can pick a private college. The student can go to a government-run college, but they still have the choice. In the government-run school system, that money goes directly to the school, regardless of the type of school that you want to go to, regardless of your choice, regardless of your satisfaction with the product. Same thing with food stamps. With food stamps, again, the money goes to the person, goes to the family. You can pick Walmart, Trader Joe's, Whole Foods. You can pick whatever type of grocery store you want and spend those dollars in the best way that you see fit for your own individual family. Imagine if the food stamps just went to Walmart and we residentially assigned families to go to Walmart or even a government-run Walmart. We wouldn't call it Walmart then, but that would be ridiculous. Everybody would think that would be ridiculous. And my main takeaway is we should fund students and not systems. The money should go to people. We're already spending it. There's no reason the government-run school should get that money, and all of that money should go to the families, or at least a significant portion of it.
That's such a good way of stating it too. And I've never looked at it from that viewpoint, but it makes sense. And I'm more libertarian-minded as well. And to have that money follow the student versus we don't have to go to a specific store because we're in that area, and that really should open a lot of people's eyes to how this works in a different way. And I want to tell all the viewers too as they're watching that. One, if you have kids that are watching right now, they're perfectly good to watch this. And even with Corey and I talking, this is a great way for your kids to be educated on choices that they also should have, because someday they're going to be old enough, they may want to make a choice. They're going to be an adult, they may have kids, they want to make a choice. And this is not anti-government, this is not anti-public school. This is really, Corey and I wanted to talk today because we want to educate people on how the system runs, but also how we could make a better overall school system for all of us, including the parents, because the parents need to take responsibility back with the kids and know what's going on. Can you dive into a little bit, because when I was studying this and researching you a little bit, I'm in the homeschool world myself with my daughter and my wife. But there's so many types of different schools out there that I will tell you when I first looked at them, oh man, I have to go look that up. I don't even know what that means. Can you go through a little bit of school 101, what a public school is, what a charter school is, because I think a lot of people get stuck on these things. They don't understand what it means.
Yeah, just to simplify matters, I'm just going to give you a really quick definition of what I see as school choice or education choice. And look, in the current government-run school system today, everybody, or in most states, you residentially assigned to a particular school, and if you want to go somewhere else, you're pretty much out of luck if you're a low-income family in particular. And if you want to go to a private school, you essentially have to pay twice by paying out of pocket for the private school tuition, but then also paying property taxes for the school that your child is no longer attending. So in basic terms, that's the most basic form of the school system that we have today. I define school choice as any move away from that residentially assigned system. So that could be taking your education dollars to a different government-run school that you're not residentially assigned to in either a different district or maybe even in your same district. So that's the most basic form of school choice, called open enrollment choice. It could be taking your education dollars and sending your kid to a charter school. Charter schools are still defined by state governments and the federal government as a public school. They are privately operated, they're independently operated, but they're completely funded based on from public dollars, and they're heavily regulated by the government, and I think that's why they are still considered to be public schools. So that's another form of school choice. And then also you can choose purely private schools through something like a voucher program, where you can take some of the money that would have went to your government school and take it to pay for private school tuition and fees. This was the whole Milton Friedman idea. There's education savings accounts where instead of taking that money in the form of a voucher, it goes into a savings account, and you can use that for private school tuition and fees, but you could also use it for tutoring, textbooks. You can use it for online learning. You could use it for homeschooling expenses. And I think that's the best form of school choice, to just give the money to a family. Don't let them, spend it on alcohol and booze and stuff like that, but have some type of regulation for saying that you have to spend it on some type of government-approved education expenditure. And then just, again, look, that's directly funding families instead of systems. And there's no reason why the money should go to the government school if their kid's not being educated in that school. The money should go to wherever the kid's getting an education and wherever the family sees that education is happening best. And it tends to happen best when parents get the choice to be able to choose the better schools, whether that's a private, charter, magnet, and it could just be a different government-run school. So again, to recap, the basic idea of school choice is just being able to pick your school and having your child's education dollars follow them to help cover the costs that whatever that school may be. And you brought up that, some people will say that school choice is anti-public school. No, it's not. It's just pro-family. It's pro-child. It's pro-choice. I mean, I've always said that I don't care if you choose to go to another government-run school. I tend to believe that private schools in the long run would probably get more customers just because of the competitive advantages, and because private providers tend to provide better services than government services. But I don't think that the government school should be off the table. That should be an option too. And if everybody still picks the government schools, then that's fine. And that really should get to the point that if people are leaving their government schools, and if you think that getting the chance to choose your school would lead to an exodus away from the government-run schools, you should question, well, is the government school system actually providing the services that we want for children today? And then just an analogy real quick, I like to bring up food stamps because, education funding is essentially like food stamps, where we fund the institutions instead of the families, which is completely backwards. But if I said, oh, well, you should be able to spend your food stamps at Trader Joe's or Whole Foods or Walmart instead of being residentially assigned to Walmart, that wouldn't mean that I'm in any way against Walmart. I may like Walmart for myself. I'm just for myself and my own family because of the prices or whatever, or because they do a really good job with customer service. But that's not anti-Walmart for me to say, hey, Jason, you should be able to take your food stamps to Trader Joe's or Whole Foods. That's just a completely ridiculous argument to make.
It's interesting too because as a physician, I see a lot of teachers, and let me tell you, and they're all public school, most of them. There's a small amount that are private, but the public school teachers, they're phenomenal. They care about the child. They want to educate them. My stepmother's a teacher. She's a phenomenal teacher. It's interesting because when I was in school and I went to public school, it's so different than it is now. And obviously, I don't know all the things that go on in a public school, but I had no standardized tests I had to take. When I graduated, I had one SAT test, and I scored, I'll even tell you my score, I scored at 900 on my SAT, and everyone said, you need to take it over again, you need to get into college, and I never took it over again, and you know what, lo and behold, I became a physician, and I know what I'm doing. I got the highest degree in the land, and so many people, I see parents today putting such this emphasis on you have to graduate, and yes, obviously we want kids to graduate, but we want them not to get this indoctrination education. We want them to critically think, use common sense. And there's a lot of public school system teachers out there who teach that information. But it sounds like what you're saying is you really want a free market economy when it comes to the actual school system, which would not crash the whole system. It would make the schools even more competitive and make them become better. Would you say that was the case?
Well, absolutely. If you look at all the evidence on this, there's 27 rigorous studies that look at the effects of school choice competition on the kids who remain in the government-run schools. 25 of the 27 studies find that the government schools actually up their game in response to competition, and that makes sense totally, right? That if you know that you can lose some money and lose some students, well, now you start providing better curriculum, a better product, because you have a competitive incentive to do so. And the scientific evidence is extremely clear on this particular question. The two studies that did not find positive effects found no statistically significant differences overall. So out of all the 27 studies on this, none of them find any evidence to suggest that school choice competition somehow harms the kids who are left behind in the government school system. And like you said, it goes along with the theory that competitive pressures school choice is essentially a tide that lifts all boats. It helps the kids who participate in the programs, but also helps the kids who don't even engage in school choice. You benefit from school choice from not even exercising school choice, and that's one of the most beautiful things about school choice. But I would also say that even if the evidence didn't show that the evidence does show this, but even if the evidence didn't show that the outcomes gotten any better in the government school system, that wouldn't be a legitimate argument to force people to stay in that government-run school system. So again, with the food stamp example, if I got the freedom to take my food stamps from Walmart to Trader Joe's, and Walmart for some reason, got a little worse as a result of that, that wouldn't be a legitimate argument to force me back to shopping at Walmart. That wouldn't make any sense. It's not my responsibility to make sure that the Walmart gets better when I, as a customer, leave. I should just be able to have the choice to pick whatever provider of the service works best for me. Similarly with education, I shouldn't have to worry about if the government schools are responding well to competition or not. But the reality is the evidence overwhelmingly does show that the students who remain in the government schools do benefit as well as a result. And you brought up teachers, and that's a really good point, that the bloated, expensive government school system that we have today is so heavily regulated, it makes it not very fun for teachers in the current system today. And also, although we've spent so much more in education expenditures over time since the 1960s, even after adjusting for inflation, we've increased real per pupil education expenditures by about 237%. If you look on a shorter timeline from 1992 to 2014, even after adjusting for inflation, we've increased per pupil expenditures in real terms by about 30%. Real teacher salaries over that same time have actually decreased by 2%.
Wow.
And that's because the schools don't have very much incentive to spend the money in the classroom, spend the money on the customers. And if they were really caring about spending money wisely on the customers, if they had an incentive to do that, they'd put it in the classroom to the teachers, because the teachers are the most important aspect of the educational experience. But we haven't seen that in the government-run school system. They just hire more people to have more union members and union dues, and they also increase administrative bloat and pay administrators ridiculously high and superintendents ridiculously high salaries. So I've made the argument for a long time that school choice benefits teachers too, and there's a lot of evidence on this, about 5 studies that I know of, and they all find that when school choice competition comes into play, the public school teacher salaries actually go up. None
Wow.
of these five studies find negative effects on salaries. And again, it's because the schools start to think, well, maybe I need to spend my money wisely and spend it in the classroom. And they also think, well, the teachers might leave to the private sector if they know they can get more autonomy there. So we got to raise their salaries a little bit so we don't lose our best talent.
That's a really good point, and a question I have too, because I like this. I like to look at numbers as well, especially monetary numbers. You said, I think it was around $15,000 as a year spent on a child in essentially the public education system. How much of that money actually goes to the child? And I say that, one, because my daughter's 6. Obviously, it's pretty easy to homeschool her right now. It's pretty simple. It only takes a couple hours a day, quite honestly. And my wife and I obviously have taxpayer. We spend taxes. We pay money in taxes. But it can't be $15,000 to educate a child in a year. Where does that money go to? I'm assuming a lot of administrative stuff.
Yeah, of course it goes to the administrative stuff, but it also goes to hiring more bodies instead of actually increasing direct classroom expenditures. And so the way I like to look at this, again, is citing that study finding that between 1992 and 2014, real per pupil expenditures have gone up a lot, but it's not going to the teachers. So it's going to just hiring more people. The same report by Ben Scafferty at the Kennesaw State University found that there's been a huge surge in staffing. If you look up the study, it's called Back to the Staffing Surge, that when schools get more money, they just hire more people. And I think that's really beneficial for unions because you have more political power, you have more power in numbers, but you have more power in dues and union dues, because if you have more people in the union, you have more political power and also more union dues. So we can see why it seems like that would be really beneficial, and that's why, like during the Chicago teacher strike just last year, they struck for 11 days, and one of the main things that they called for was more support staff. And we can see this direct relationship as to why the unions would be calling for something like that. And look, so again, this for direct classroom expenditures and actual teachers, they should be fighting for school choice as well. They shouldn't be fighting against their competitors. So like, just imagine if Walmart, I like to bring up Walmart because it's simple. If Walmart employees went on strike for whatever reason, right? And they wanted a pay increase, or they wanted better working conditions, the teachers or the Walmart employees wouldn't be striking against their competitors like Whole Foods and Trader Joe's, because that's their exit option. If their employer, Walmart, doesn't pay them well, they can leave to either Whole Foods, Trader Joe's, or something else. In the education system, the organization or the people who feel the pain from the strike is the family. The family is essentially, they still have to pay their property taxes. They don't get a property tax rebate during a strike, and they have to scramble to figure out where to send their kids. The school district, the employer, isn't feeling any of the pain, so they don't have a really strong incentive to change things going forward. And so we have this never-ending cycle with teacher strikes in the United States. And if we had school choice, we'd fix that problem. And we would have the pain being felt by the actual employer. Because when Walmart closes down because of a strike, I can shop at any other location and I don't have to feel the pain of that.
Interesting. And it sounds like this is, obviously, like anything, this is a huge educational area, not just for obviously the kids, but a lot of parents, it sounds like, probably don't have enough information, because this has kind of been confused on purpose for them so that we don't see all this stuff. Because I think one of the biggest things I hear, and I'd like to hear your viewpoint on this from a parental standpoint of how parents think, because I'm sure you hear from them, is I think a lot of parents get afraid that, like, oh my gosh, if they're not in the public education system, I can't be home in time. But really, that, like, the private school, the charter school, really is just giving the parent responsibility on where they want to send the kid, but the schedule might still be the same. It's not like they're going to come home and be alone half the day because the parent has to work. But give me your viewpoint on that, because I think a lot of parents get scared that if they have to change, it may throw off the whole schedule.
Yeah, you can still have a different type of brick and mortar school. It could be a charter school, just like you said. It could be a magnet school. It could be a private school. And individual families, the big thing I want to do is have individual families make that decision for their own circumstances. And again, it could be the same exact schedule as what's going on in the government schools. But then also, if you had those $15,000 that we're spending and you had that to cover homeschooling expenses, that would help a lot of families adjust and be able to figure out how to provide homeschooling as well. It would obviously help you afford private schools. Average private school tuition in the U.S. right now, obviously it fluctuates, but it's around $11,000 according to Private School Review website. That's much less than the $15,000. You can afford a full private school tuition if you just had the money that would have went to your government run, would have followed your kid to the government run school. So you should be able to make these decisions. But then also with homeschooling, they have things called hybrid homeschooling, for example. If you don't want to do homeschooling full time and educate your children directly, you can send them perhaps to a brick and mortar school for a couple days a week and then homeschool the rest of the time. And you can really fit your own schedule depending on what's working best for your own individual situation with your family. So that might be a private school, still brick and mortar. It could be a virtual school from home, but maybe you can figure out how to make a hybrid homeschool work for your kids. Maybe you can figure out how to use those $15,000 to adjust fully to full-time homeschooling. Then also there's homeschool co-ops. You don't have to educate your children on every single subject yourself to be a homeschooler. You can send your kid to a homeschool co-op, which is essentially like a micro school in a sense, and where other parents can be teaching or other experts can be teaching. And just imagine if you set up a homeschool co-op with 20 students, $15,000 a student. That's a lot of money that an individual teacher or a group of teachers could be making with the education savings accounts route. So we should really think about how we could provide a much better education. We don't have to have these big shopping mall, gigantic schools that we have today. There's no reason why we need to have that. We could instead cut down on a lot of these capital costs and pay the teachers directly. And again, this is another way to benefit teachers because they could make a whole lot of money just getting 20 students to go to their newly formed school or whatever you want to call it, a homeschool co-op. That's another way to do it. And I want to bring up another point that is made by the other side. People will say that they have some emotional connection to their public school because maybe they went to a public school and they believe that school choice will destroy that government school system. Well, my first response is if no one leaves and if that government school system is actually great, no one's going to leave. There will be no change. and they'll have really no effect. But if and so like the logical conclusion of that is that you actually don't think your government school system is all that great. But then also, the claim is that you're draining money from the government schools, but the reality is government schools are draining money from families. School choice just allows the money to follow the family and be returned to the rightful owner, which is the family. We don't say allowing people to spend food stamps at Trader Joe's drains money from Walmart, and it doesn't really matter if it drains money from Walmart or not. The money doesn't belong to Walmart. The money's meant for feeding families. The education dollars are meant for helping kids get a good education. It's not supposed to be a jobs program. It's not supposed to be a way to fund a system that never improves, a government monopoly. It's not what the money's for. It's for the families, and we need to realize that. But another thing that they don't realize is that I will say government schools are funded based on the amount of students who are enrolled in the school, but they're not completely funded based on enrollments. There's some block grants, there's some other forms of funding, and the Georgetown University has something called Edunomics Lab, where they've gone state by state and estimated how much of funding that goes to government schools is truly based on differences in enrollment. They estimate that in most states it's about 60 to 80% of the funding is based on student enrollments. Well, what does that mean? Well, if you leave a school and take a voucher to a private school, that government school gets to keep 20 to 40% of your funding for not even educating that child. So on a per pupil basis, the government school actually financially benefits. So if anything, government schools are actually profiting from school choice. School choice isn't actually draining money. If anything, it's the opposite. The problem is the government schools want to keep 100% of the funding for a student who's no longer there. That wouldn't make any sense.
Right. Just
like it wouldn't make any sense to let Walmart keep 100% of the food stamps. Just another example, because I've used Walmart so many times, is just we have Pell Grants and GI Bills. We have GI Bills for veterans to go spend at a college of their choice. Just imagine if the government says, well, you can only spend that at your nearest community college. All of those GI Bills or Pell Grants need to go to the community college. And if you go somewhere else, too bad, you lose your GI Bill or your Pell Grant. That wouldn't make any sense. And in the current system, that's what happens in the K-12 system. And just think about it. The way that we do school voucher programs today is if you leave to another school, the government school gets to keep 20 to 40%. What if your community college got to keep 20 to 40% of your GI Bill after transferring to a better university? That wouldn't make any sense either. The community college would probably like that deal, and I argue that the government schools at the K-12 level should also like that deal, but here we go. They're still complaining, even though they get to keep a lot of the money for students who aren't even there anymore.
It sounds like almost a utopian, wonderful world of competitive education, meaning the education gets better, we get a better product, which the product ultimately is a child who can understand, has some data from obviously history and everything else, but also can critically think, logically think, use common sense. But also, when you bring in this kind of competition, which really is a libertarian free market idea, is you knock the deep state out of this whole thing, so the quote-unquote deep state, but also you make competition from a teaching standpoint. I mean, I actually view this as, teachers could really do well because the ones who work at their craft become better, constantly educate themselves, etc. They're going to be in such high demand that you might have some of the highest paid teachers out there because they really get the product, which is the student who knows something.
Yeah, if you just look at how much money goes towards the classroom today, teachers on average in the U.S. make $60,000 per year, and I think we spend about, $300,000 in the classroom. Where's all the money going? It's not going to the teacher. And like you said, school choice would be really beneficial for teachers, primarily for teachers who want to start their own homeschool co-op or their own mini school, where you get $15,000 per student and you get 20 students. Well, there you go. It's $300,000. That's a lot more than $60,000. Of course, you'd have to cover some other fixed costs as well, but if you don't have to pay for the actual big school building, you can be much more efficient with actually providing students with a one-on-one education and providing them a really great education at a fraction of the cost. And then look, the teachers could pocket a lot of that money as well. It seems like a win-win situation. The only people who lose are the vested interests. It's the teachers' unions. And that's just too bad because education and the education system shouldn't be about the teachers' unions. It should be about kids. That's the point of the education system, is to provide a meaningful education to people, to families, to kids. And what better way to do that than to let the dollars follow the children to wherever they're getting an education? And that could be the government school. But I have a feeling that if families had a real choice in the matter, they would choose either a private school or a homeschool. Just a recent statistics I'll give you, since you like numbers and stuff. EdChoice just came out with a nationally representative survey, and this is an organization that used to be called the Friedman Foundation for Educational Choice, named after Milton Friedman to begin with. They had a third party do this nationally representative survey, and they just asked people, asked a bunch of parents. I think their sample size was about 2,000 or 1,000 or 2,000 people, and they asked them, as a result of COVID-19, how have your views changed on homeschooling? 52% of those families said that they had a more favorable view about homeschooling, and it's probably because they're understanding that their kids are much happier, less stressed, they feel less anxious. They're learning a lot. They're learning better. They're actually interested in what they're doing, and they're doing it at a fraction of the time as the amount of time it takes to get the same amount of work done in the government school. And they're having much more one-on-one learning experiences with their children. They really like it. Half of that proportion said that they view homeschooling less favorably. So families are twice as likely to say that they view homeschooling as more favorably. And I will say, this isn't even like the best form of homeschooling that we can imagine, right? This is a time where everybody's locked in their homes and they can't really go play outside as much, and they can't really go to community activities like the museum or go to church or do any other type of socialization activities. So that we're finding that people like this version of homeschooling more than their government school system tells us a lot about the inadequacy of many government-run schools in our country today. And this really just, I think, shines a light and puts data to the anecdotes that we've been hearing, that a lot of families have been saying that, hey, after this, I'm never sending my kids back to the public school again. I'm going to continue homeschooling. I think this is really great. This is, for the first time, EdChoice has put data and put numbers behind these anecdotes. And I think it's a great thing that families are figuring this out, and maybe this will be a great awakening for homeschooling overall, and then also just for families to take a step back and look at whether this factory model of schooling is actually how we should structure our education system today. And I think a lot of people are saying, well, this doesn't make any sense. I think the homeschooling stuff makes sense. And then again, I'm not saying homeschooling is the very best for everybody, but I think there's going to be a large increase in the proportion of homeschoolers. Right now, we're essentially all homeschoolers in a sense. And, even if only 2% of families make that switch, that's still 1 million more homeschoolers. That would be about a 50% increase in the proportion of school-age population who are actually identified as homeschoolers. If that happened next year, that would be a huge shift. I think this is really giving people a really great opportunity. Obviously, a pandemic is not a great thing. There's a lot of hardship going on. Don't get me wrong. But if we take it, one of the silver linings from the pandemic is that people are getting a more realistic look of what's going on in the government school system, and maybe perhaps where it's falling short in particular areas. And again, maybe people will see that, look, there's another survey out, a big survey that came out from Common Sense Media, and their finding is pretty common sense, actually, that they asked families, do your kids go to a private school or a public school? And they asked, has your school been continuing virtual education since the lockdown started? The private schools were over twice as likely, the students in private schools were over twice as likely to have a continuing continuity of education if they were in a private school than if they were in a public school. And this makes sense because the private schools have a competitive pressure to do a good job. They know they can lose their customers if they don't get their response right. And so I think a lot of families are also seeing that, look, I mean, the private school sector is really going out of their way to do a good job, and maybe a lot of families will try to make that switch. And obviously, even if a family wants to make that switch, the reality today is that a lot can't because of the systems and the funding mechanism we have in place. So maybe more people will fight for school choice options because they've seen that, look, private schools and charter schools could actually be a really good idea, since they have every incentive in the world to treat my student right, to make sure that they're in a safe environment, to make sure they're actually learning, and to make them feel like real human beings that are actually getting a great education. I think families are figuring that out.
It makes complete sense, and it's so interesting because I think what you just talked about, it's so comprehensive that even the questions that I would probably pull up are actually handled in this, because anytime you send it back to the market and you actually look for the product, which is a child who is well educated, common sense, critical thinking, etc., that in turn actually handles things that are close to me, like medical freedom, vaccine choice, mental health, all this different stuff, even inner cities, because it actually could handle that stuff where people might be lesser income, but at the same time, when you add this competition level, even if it's not a private school or anything like that, the choices come out of the woodwork on how to help these kids. And I always think that humanity as a whole, we have good hearts, and we actually want our children to be well. And so no matter what economic level you are, no matter where you come from, whether you have parents or you're adopted, whatever, like, we actually all tune in to wanting these kids to succeed.
Well, and I will say school choice is one of the very few policy mechanisms that we have available to us today that should be a nonpartisan issue. Right. Conservatives tend to already like school choice because of the market, the free market aspects to it, and a lot of the left-leaning indoctrination that's already happening in our government-run schools today. But the left should like it too, because school choice is an equalizer. The rich already essentially have school choice in that they can already afford to send their kids to the best government-run schools. They can afford to live in the fancy houses, the fancy neighborhoods that tend to be assigned to the best government schools. They can already afford to send their kid to a private school out of pocket and essentially pay for two schools, one through the property tax system, one through out-of-pocket expenses. So school choice is an equalizer too. So it's one of those few policies that everybody should be able to agree, except for the teachers' unions, except for the people trying to protect the monopoly system. If you actually care about families, if you actually care about students, and that is your main priority, school choice should be a no-brainer. And it should not be a political partisan issue at all. I'm glad the conservatives are on the side of school choice already, and for the most part. And there are some, don't get me wrong, there are some Democrats who favor school choice as well, but in the large scheme of things, conservatives tend to be much more likely, at least, to support school choice mechanisms.
Interesting.
But it shouldn't be this way.
Totally.
There's no reason why we should fund systems instead of families.
Definitely. And I want to touch base on this last topic before we head out today, which is the fun one. So you have gone fully at, and I don't even remember her name, the professor from Harvard, I believe it was. Bartholet, yes. So I think it was a week or two ago now. I know time is going so slow now during this whole pandemic. It feels like it's been 6 months already. It's only been 6 weeks roughly. But she came out with just this, this article was chock full of, I actually personally, I'll admit, as I read through the article, I laughed hysterically as I was going through it, because it was so over the top that I almost couldn't believe she said it. But the fact is, she basically says it's like child abuse. Being a homeschool individual is like being child abuse. We're pumping our kids full of ideologies, and essentially, honestly, at the end of the day, and I've heard this from several people and I call it the deep state because it's a word that people know today. It's well used, but it's more kind of the over the top liberal left leaning side. Is they really want kids to be property of quote unquote the state. But you have gone after this. Give me a summary of what's going on here.
I mean, she's co-organizing a conference at Harvard Law School coming up in June, and in its description, it's explicitly anti-homeschooling. And she's, again, saying that essentially homeschooling is all about child abuse and it's a way to abuse your children, and that it's a form of educational maltreatment, which, again, is just bogus because it flies in the face of all the scientific evidence that we have on the subject of homeschooling. So that's just one issue. But she co-organized it with a guy named Professor James Dwyer, who is famously known for ridiculously saying that the reason parent-child relationships exist is that the state or the government confers legal parenthood, essentially saying that you're only parents at all because the government allows you to be parents. You should be grateful, essentially, that the government allows you to be parents because in the first place, he argues, essentially, that your children belong to the government, which is completely ridiculous. And this is essentially the same ideology put forth by Elizabeth Bartholet, the other organizer at the conference coming up at Harvard Law School, in that she calls for a presumptive ban on homeschooling. And what that means is that she thinks that the burden of proof should be on families to prove to the government that why they should be able to educate their own children at home. And she argues, oh, well, it shouldn't be all that big of a deal because if you're a good parent, in my definition, and what that seems to mean is that you're not religious, you're not Christian, because in her articles, she likes to cite how a lot of homeschooling families are religious. And I mean, it's almost like she doesn't know that we're all American citizens. We have the First Amendment right to freely exercise our religion. I'm not a religious person myself, but I understand we all have that First Amendment right, even if Elizabeth Bartholet and other Harvard Ivy League elites don't like that fact. We all have that right. And it just seems to be that she doesn't like indoctrination if it's not the type of indoctrination that she likes, which probably is the type of left-leaning indoctrination that we see all too often in the government school system today. But yeah, essentially, I mean, if you take her logic and expand it to other forms of liberties, that's just like saying we shouldn't have the Fourth Amendment because if you're not hiding anything, well then you should be able to prove to us that you're not hiding anything. It's essentially this idea that everybody should be guilty for whatever reason until proven innocent. And as we know as American citizens, we are all innocent until proven guilty. It's not the other way around. The proof should be on the government. The burden of proof should be on the government as to why they should be able to take our kids away from us and be able to force them to go to government-run schools. They should be able to prove to us that abuse isn't happening in government-run schools, and they should have to prove to us that kids are actually getting an education in government schools. The reality is, all too often, that's not happening. In the most recent year of the nation's report card, 2 out of every 3 students are not proficient in reading in the United States. 3 out of every 4 students are not proficient in civic outcomes. And even higher rates are not proficient. 85% of kids are not proficient in U.S. history. And so it's completely ridiculous for her to say that there's educational maltreatment and abuse happening in homeschooling when, she should, if anything, applying her own logic to the education system, writ large, she should be calling for a presumptive ban on government schooling, not homeschooling. All the rigorous evidence finds that overall, homeschoolers tend to do better academically and socially and civically than their kids and their otherwise similar kids in the nearby government-run schools.
Interesting. It sounds like basically our exact society, the way it is right now, is essentially a product of what's come out of the schools that they've been in control of, and really they want to push it over the edge, which is essentially communism at that point.
Well, it's pretty laughable, actually, that she says that, we need government-run schools and we can't have homeschooling because we need a more democratic society, and she doesn't really define what that actually means. But as I point out first, the government schools are not producing high success rates on the nation's report card on civic outcomes or U.S. history outcomes. And homeschoolers tend to actually have better results on all of these types of outcomes. But then also we're living in an extreme era of political polarization. And it's almost laughable that she says, okay, look, we have this extreme era of political polarization. And then she blames the 3% of people who are identified as homeschoolers as being the root of all of our problems. Well, maybe it's because of the 90% of kids who are in government schools aren't receiving a really great democratic education, in the government schools on a wide scale today. Maybe the government schools have something to do with the reason that we're in this era of extreme political polarization in the United States today. Maybe it's the government schools that are not teaching people how to be tolerant of others' viewpoints. I mean, if you look at the most rigorous evidence on this topic too, if you look at the students who go to private schools, so who just randomly get the chance to use a voucher to go to private schools, to the kids who are who have to go to the government-run schools, the private school evidence is extremely large as well on things like tolerance of other people's viewpoints, and then also just political knowledge and political participation. So, if anything, again, she should be calling for a presumptive ban on government schools, not home schools, not private schools. And I mean, it's also laughable that she argues that she essentially tries to link homeschooling to white supremacy. And she doesn't give any statistics as to how many white supremacists are homeschooling. But, I mean, her argument is that we should have a presumptive ban on homeschooling. Well, somebody better tell her that in 1922, the KKK actually explicitly fought to make private education illegal in Oregon. Luckily, in 1925, the U.S. Supreme Court struck down that idiotic law and famously said that the child is not the mere creature of the state. And some people, like these Harvard law professors and others, should remember that court case and remember that the burden of proof should be on the government. It shouldn't be on parents, because we are the best stewards of the well-being of our own children, not government bureaucrats. I mean, if you look at the data and abuse going on in government schools, there's a website real quick. It's sexualabuseinschools.org. There's weekly new reports of sexual abuse going on in schools, and a lot of times, on average, a GAO report from 2010 found that educators who engage in this type of sexual misconduct pass between 3 different school districts before actually getting held accountable for their actions. And they could have up to 72 different child victims throughout their lifetime. And this is a Government Accountability Office report from 2010 that actually found this. And then the U.S. Department of Education similarly found that children who go through government schools today, 1 in 10 children are estimated to experience some form of educator sexual misconduct just by the employees in the system by the time those kids graduate from high school. And that doesn't even count all of the sexual misconduct and abuse that goes on from the other students. That's just employees in the system. So it's really odd to me that Elizabeth Bartholet she just doesn't want to look at all that evidence, and instead says, well, there's this. She doesn't even give statistics as to how often abuse is happening in the home, and says, well, we should essentially ban homeschooling and force more people to go in government schools. But what she doesn't take note of is that in attempting to reduce and minimize homeschool abuse happening in the home, that she doesn't even really have statistics to back up, you are essentially forcing kids to to shift into more dangerous situations. And so again, it's just completely unscientific. Even in her peer-reviewed article in the Arizona Law Review, it's about 80 pages of unintellectual, anti-scientific stuff where she just doesn't really have very strong citations behind her claims, and just says that many things are happening, or that this is happening sometimes, and she never compares it to the policy relevant alternative of homeschooling, which is if you can't homeschool your kids, they got to go somewhere else. They're not going to heaven and going to a perfect scenario. They're not going to be surrounded by angels. They're going to be in the government-run school system, and that's the more intellectual and rigorous and intellectually honest way of evaluating the merits of homeschooling, is to compare it to the relevant and realistic alternative, the government schools.
Well, I'm glad that people are hitting back against them like yourselves, and I know they have a seminar coming up in June, which is going to be insane, but they have a competition for that seminar as well, someone doing the exact opposite, and I appreciate all that, because obviously it's way over the edge, and I know there's people that do believe that things that she believes in, but I think there's enough of us out there who are educating enough, and sir, I appreciate you for doing all the education you do, because you are one of the most vocal out there on this, and it's such an important thing, because at the end of the day, we're adults and we're fighting every day, but really the future of civilization is always based on our kids, and our kids being intelligent, and our kids making good choices, acting on common sense, and being just great citizens going forward. And so you are helping do that. You are on Twitter firing it up every single day. Before we head out today, let everyone know where they can find you and where they can follow your material so they can be educated constantly on this.
Yeah, I'm probably on Twitter too much, so but I share everything on there. It's at DeAngelis Corey. It's just my last name and then my first name. You can find my stuff there, and I also want to give a shout out that Harvard Kennedy School is actually hosting a response conference to the anti-homeschooling law school propaganda conference against homeschooling. So I'm actually going to be speaking at that Harvard Kennedy School live conference that's available to the public, unlike the anti-homeschooling conference. But that'll be on Friday, this Friday, May 1st at 2 p.m. Eastern, and there'll be other pro-homeschooling voices being heard there as well, such as Carrie McDonald, who's affiliated with the Foundation for Economic Education, Peter Gray, Kevin Soling, and others as well. So I really would appreciate if people came out to that and saw our good ideas, because look, we're not going to shut our ideas out like the other conference that is private and invite only. We're going to let everybody see our ideas, because we believe truly that we have the better ideas, and I think the best way to show the world that is to let everybody see those ideas.
Excellent. I appreciate it. And if anybody has any questions for Corey, please head over to his Twitter page. He is very active. He'll see it, reply to you. You are a breath of fresh air. You are full of ideas, and I really appreciate your time today, Corey. Thank you very much for being on the show.
Thanks a lot, Jason. Have a good one.
You got it. Dr. Jason Dean, Revolution Network, signing off today with Corey DeAngelis of the Reason Foundation. Go check his information out and spread this as much as possible, because he really is a fountain of information out there at such a young age, allowing you to understand what this is really like. And he breaks down some really, it's kind of, it was complicated information for me too. I had to sit down and kind of, define some words and understand some stuff, and he does it so well. So really good stuff. You guys have an amazing day. Keep the strength out there. Let's take care of our kids and build an amazing civilization. Have a good one. I'll see you later tonight, live stream. Have a good day. Bye-bye.